Hello, welcome to my video, and in here I'm going to cover a game between Richard Rapport and Sergey Karjakin from the Vugar Gashimov Memorial. And we got Moscow Sicilian, but with knight e7, which is the most fighting move, I would say. Now white plays d4, and after cd, queen takes. Black finishes developing by knight f6, bishop g5, and now a6. Now if the bishop goes back, that's not in the spirit of this line. The whole point of this line, I believe, is that white gives up the bishop pair, but in return he gets the control over the center. If you go bishop a4 here, he may go just b5 and go e6 with bishop b7 and even knight c5 next. So that's not really a very pleasant continuation for white. That's why he takes on d7 here, bishop d7, and now castles. And what's interesting here, after h6, now white gives up the other bishop, so we have a knight pair versus bishop pair. But the problem for black is that his bishops are not really on the open. Bishop on f8 is just stuck. There's no freeing move like d5, which would open up both bishops. And now white is trying to somehow restrict those bishops to keep them limited, and he tries with c4. And now black plays e6, knight c3, developing move, and now bishop e7. To stop b5 from happening, white plays a4. Black plays queen a5 here, trying to stop a5 and also to get his queen to the other side, maybe to go queen h5 next, have some action on the g file. Now white plays rook b1, prepares eventually some b4 move in the future, and now queen b4, because now black wants to capture an a4, and that's why white plays b3. Now h5. With h5 he wants to just fix the kingside pawns by h4, trying to put some pressure on g2. Now rook fd1 is played, h4, and now knight e1. He wants to get his knight from c2 to e3 to defend on g2. Queen c5. Now black offers a trade of queens, which would be good for black, because after a move like this, then bishops might be in a good spot here. This bishop might go to d8 and c7, getting this diagonal, which is very useful. The bishop might get to c6, putting some pressure also indirectly to g2. So logically, white avoids this by queen d3, and now rook c8. Now white has to be careful about any b5 breaks because of the pin on the c file. And now Rapport makes a small mistake here. He plays knight c2. We have some x-ray on the c file, and now the b5 move is possible to play. If the knight was not on c2, white could just take on b5, but in this case, black can play h3 first to weaken the light squares on the king side, and if g3, then b5. If knight e3 to protect c4, then after b4, knight e2, bishop c6, another bishop goes to b6 from d8 to b6, and the position becomes really unpleasant for white. f5 might come next with opening up the light square diagonal. Instead of h3, he plays queen g5, tries to double on the g file, and now b4 by Rapport. Here it was better to go knight e3, and after h3 just go g3. And then f4, and in comparison to the previous line, black's pieces are not that dangerous. Bishops are still very undeveloped, but he plays this. Karjakin plays rook g8, which is a very natural move, but actually f5 was the move to play. And it looks very weird at the first glance. You might think, what is he doing? He's just making his pawns weaker and weaker. What happens if white takes? Then queen takes. And now actually you cannot take on f5, because after this, all of a sudden c4 pawn is under attack. If you try this, then black has f4. And after this, just rook c4, and black should be more than fine. So after queen f5, if he needs to go back to e2, then black might even go queen e5 here, offering a trade again. Having this c4 pawn weak, it's quite annoying to have this as a threat. But instead, Karjakin plays a logical rook g8, after which Rapport has knight e3, pretty much stabilizes the position after this move. g2 is protected. How is black going to continue this? He tries this, queen e2, and now he tries to get his king to f8 to g7 to get his king out of the danger. Probably he wanted to push f5 and he wanted to take from the pin on the e file. And now Rapport plays a5, trying to fix those pawns on the queen side, and now king g7. Again, maybe a move like f5 was working out for black. He went to g7, king h1, and now king h8. He made an artificial castle, rook f1, he prepares the f4 break, and now queen h6. Trying to not allow f4 with tempo, f4, and now h3. It was interesting to play f5, and in case of capturing, to go h3. Because now after g3, bishop c6 might be a bit unpleasant, and after this to go bishop h4. And now maybe when a threat of bishop g3 comes to mind, this might be some kind of counterplay for black. But he plays first this, and now g4. After which black plays queen h4 after f5. Now you don't have f5 anymore as black. Black tried to double on the g file, but now rook f3. He wants to attack on h3. Black doubles, rook g1, rook h7, and rook gg3. He's doubling on the third rank, trying to target the h3 pawn. And now black somehow tries to break the center by d5. Now his idea was to, after capturing, bishop d6, to kick this rook from g3 back. And now black should have played just knight e4, and after capturing, to take with the pawn. And after queen h6 back, just take, go rook f6. White has plenty of pawns for the exchange. But instead, he took on h3, and now we got some interesting position. After knight e4, attacking f6 and bishop on d6, now black decides to take on h2. And we have this quite imbalanced endgame. Here black took on f5, white takes on f6, f4, and now knight g2. And black plays a really interesting move here. He plays rook c8. He gives up the bishop, but he wants to capture some pawns in white's camp. For example, if he went just rook d8, I think this would be okay for him. Because after knight f4, let's say, bishop a4, I think black is fine here. Also, king can get closer and black can hold this. But he chose to defend more actively and he went for rook c8, but now white takes, rook c4, and now knight e5. It was better to just go knight h4 here. And in case of this, to just go knight f6, to push g5. You cannot go king g7, that's the problem, because of the fork on f5. For example, if you take on b4, then d6 just works for white. Because if you go here, then d7 also, knight f5 comes next, and it's impossible to hold this. But instead he plays knight e5, and now rook d4 and d6. Now the pawn is not for free because the fork on f7 happens in that case. Now Karjakin plays f6, which is again a mistake. If he played king g8 here, it's just a draw because now white loses the pawn on d6 and it's much easier for black to defend. Because if you try with d7, then there is f6, and eventually you will pick up this pawn on d7. But he plays f6, and now check. Black goes king g7. If he tried this, then rook f4, rook d6. There is some problem because white can go knight e3, knight d5. If you play this, then there is always some trick like knight d5 and white defends everything and white's king just slowly goes in. The b7 pawn is weak, f6 as well, and it's practically not possible to hold this position. After this, he plays king g7 instead. Now knight h4. Now if you take on d6, there is this fork. King goes to f7, and now knight f5. Rook goes to d2. He wants to play f3 next to use the pin on the second rank. So that's why king goes to g1 to escape this pin. f3 and now knight f4. A very nice move, trying to limit the black's king, to try to stop him to get to e6. Now he goes to e8, king f1 and king d7. Temporarily black stops this pawn, and here white plays knight h5. The best move here was to go king e1. And after this, to go king f1. And now we have a bit of a zugzwang. If the king moves, then you have knight e6, knight c5 and start pushing the pawn on d6. But with knight h5, king gets to e6, and after this check, king gets to e5. And now knight h5. For example, if he went for this, king e6. Now knight f8 is a strong move. If you go to f7, then knight d7 I think works out with knight c5 and starting to push the d pawn. And if he goes here, then just knight d7 again. This time targeting even f6. So he went for knight h5, and now rook b2, king e1. Now he tries to push the d pawn, f2, and now king f1. Rook b4, king f2, and now rook g4. Black took lots of pawns. Instead of taking g4, it was better to just go rook b5. Take on a5 and to try to control the d pawn later on and start pushing the a pawn. But he went for rook g4, and now d7 goes. Rook g8, and now knight h6. And after knight h6, just resigned, which was weird. Okay, if you go for something like rook d8, then knight f7, and if king e6 takes here, takes king c6, let's say king e3, takes, this is clear. This is winning for white, for sure. Something like f5, go here, force the pawn to move, and finally you get this fork, after which the endgame is totally winning. So that's not a problem, that's quite clear. Rook d8 is okay, rook d8 is lost for black. But what's strange is that after king d6, now if you take on g8, now black takes on d7 and he goes towards the b5 square. I don't know what is this. Is it supposed to be winning or not? Probably it should be. Should be winning, but still there is some technique to show. But this was quite strange that Karjakin just resigned in this position and didn't consider just playing on. If you like the video, subscribe. Bye bye.